My name is Victor, and at 52 years old, I hadn't kissed anyone in 5 years. Not since the morning my wife drove into town and never came home. 5 years passed like that. So when a 28-year-old woman with red hair dared me to kiss her at a backyard party with 30 people watching, I should have laughed it off. The string lights buzzed overhead, beer warm in my hand, the whole yard waiting for the punchline. But what I saw in her eyes wasn't a joke. And I kissed her, and the whole yard went quiet. I live alone in a house I built with my own hands, just outside a small town in Oregon called Silverton. The house sits on 2 acres of fir trees and gravel, and most mornings the only sound is the table saw warming up in the workshop out back. I'm a carpenter. I build dining tables and bookshelves and kitchen cabinets for people who want something that lasts longer than they do. And the work is honest in a way that people rarely are. A crooked joint can be straightened if you catch it early, and a board with a split can be glued and clamped and made whole. The wood doesn't care if you're broken or lonely or tired. If you treat it right, it holds, and there's something fair about that. My wife was named Anne. She was the kind of woman who could make a room feel warmer just by walking into it, and I spent 15 years trying to deserve that warmth without ever quite knowing if I had. She had a habit of pressing her hand to the back of my neck when she could tell I was carrying something heavy, and it was like she'd found the switch that held all the tension in my body and turned it off. 5 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday morning, she drove into Salem for groceries, and a man ran a red light and she never came home. I got the call at the workshop, mid-sanded edge on a bookshelf for a couple in town, and I remember setting the sander down and staring at it because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The first year after Anne was the kind of hard that doesn't have a name. I kept building things because my hands needed work the way lungs need air, and the workshop was the only place where the silence made sense. Sawdust and wood glue and the hum of the table saw filled the space where her voice used to be, and I let them. The second year was quieter, and not in a good way. By the third year, I had stopped expecting her to walk through the door, and by the fourth, I had built a routine that functioned like a wall around the day. Wake at 5, feed the dog I'd gotten because the house was too quiet, work until the light faded, heat something from a can, go to bed early. The phone didn't ring much after 8 o'clock, and somewhere along the way I had stopped wanting it to. Pete called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was cutting dados for a shelf unit in his garage. He's a plumber I've known for 20 years, the kind of friend who sticks around not because you're easy to be with, but because he's loyal and stubborn and doesn't know how to quit a person. He said he was having a barbecue at his place on Saturday, a backyard thing with string lights and a smoker and more people than his yard could comfortably hold. He said his niece had just moved to town from Colorado, and he wanted her to meet people who weren't still in their 20s. Then he said the thing he'd been building toward, the same thing he always said. I needed to get out of the house. I almost told him no. The word was right there, practiced and ready. The same word I'd used to decline every invitation for the past 3 years. But Pete had that tone in his voice, the one that meant he'd already decided and was only calling to make it sound like I had a say. I heard myself say, "All right," before I'd finished deciding, and the word surprised me more than anything had in a long time. That night, I stood in front of my closet and looked at shirts I hadn't worn since Anne's funeral. They still had the dry cleaner's crease pressed into them, stiff and sharp like they'd been waiting for something important enough to justify putting them on. I pulled a plain blue button-down off the hanger and held it up. It smelled like the back of the closet, like stillness and stored time and nothing alive. I told myself it was just a barbecue, that I'd stay an hour and then slip out, and that no one would notice if I left early because no one had noticed me in years. The dog watched me from the bedroom doorway with his head tilted to one side, like he was trying to understand what had changed in the routine. I couldn't explain it because I didn't understand it either. I drove to Pete's house at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening with the windows down and the radio off because I needed the air to keep me honest about where I was going. His place sat at the end of a gravel road outside town, a squat yellow house with a big backyard and a porch that sagged on the left side where the support post had shifted. He'd been meaning to fix it for 3 years, and I'd been meaning to offer, and neither of us had gotten around to it. We notice what needs fixing and we file it away and we wait for it to become urgent. The backyard was already full when I walked through the side gate. String lights crisscrossed above the picnic tables in loops of warm yellow, and the smoker was going in the corner, pouring thin white smoke into the evening air. I counted maybe 30 people, most of them in their 30s, a few couples I recognized from town, some kids running between the tables with paper plates. I was the oldest person there by at least a decade, and I felt it the way you feel a draft, not in any one spot, but everywhere at once. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and found a place near the back fence where I could lean and watch without being in the middle of anything. The beer was cold, and the evening was warm, and the string lights made everything look softer than it was, and I thought maybe this would be enough. I'd show up, I'd stay an hour, I'd drink 1 beer, and I'd go home, and the routine would close back over me like water. Pete found me there after about 20 minutes, and he wasn't alone. He had a woman with him, younger than the rest of the crowd, with red hair pulled back in a loose knot, and sharp eyes that took me in the way a person does when they're actually looking rather than just glancing. He put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Victor, this is my niece Charlotte. She just moved here from Denver to teach 3rd grade at the elementary school. Charlotte, this is the best carpenter in 3 counties, and he's also the most stubborn man I know, so don't let him convince you he doesn't need to be at a party." Charlotte smiled, and it wasn't the polite smile I expected from someone meeting a stranger at a barbecue. It was smaller and more specific, like she'd already decided something about me and was waiting to see if she was right. She said, "Pete's told me a lot about you. He says you can build anything." I said I could build most things, and that the things I couldn't build usually weren't worth building. She laughed at that, a short, clean sound that landed somewhere I'd forgotten existed, and I felt the beer in my hand go warm because I'd stopped drinking it. We talked for 40 minutes. She didn't do what people usually do, asking questions they don't want the answer to. She asked what I was building right now, and when I told her about the dining table for a family of 6, she asked what kind of wood and why that kind and how I chose the grain direction. Nobody had asked me those questions in years, not even Pete, and I found myself talking longer than I meant to about the difference between oak and walnut and how each one moves differently when the seasons change. She listened like the answers mattered, and I couldn't remember the last time someone had listened to me like that. She told me about teaching 3rd grade in a town where the grocery store closed at 8. She told me she'd left Denver because she wanted somewhere she could hear herself think, and I understood that in a way I didn't expect to. She was 28 and I was 52, and the gap between those 2 numbers should have made the conversation feel awkward, but it didn't. She talked to me like I was just a person, not an age, not a grief, not a man who had stopped trying. The game started around 8 o'clock, when the light started going and the string lights became the only thing keeping the dark back. Someone suggested truth or dare, and the yard groaned and laughed in the way people do when they're pretending they don't want to play a game they haven't played since college. Rick, a guy I'd met once at Pete's last barbecue, was the one pushing for it. He was already on his 4th beer and loud in the way that 4th beers make people, and he had the kind of energy that fills a room whether the room wants it or not. I should have left right then. The hour I'd promised myself was up, and the routine was calling from the other end of the gravel road. But Charlotte was still next to me, and leaving would mean saying goodbye to her, and I hadn't figured out how to do that without it meaning more than I wanted it to. The circle formed on the grass near the smoker, maybe 15 of us, and the game moved around the group with the slow randomness of people who are mostly pretending to think about their choices. Someone picked truth and admitted they'd dented Pete's truck and never told him. Someone else picked dare and had to sing the national anthem, which was terrible and wonderful and made everyone laugh in the way that only bad singing can. Then it landed on Charlotte. She picked dare without hesitating, and Rick's face lit up like he'd been waiting for this. He leaned forward with his beard dangling from his fingers and a grin I didn't trust, and he said, "I dare you to dare the old guy to kiss you." He pointed at me when he said it, and the yard laughed. I was the old guy, the punchline, and I felt it land on my chest like a cold hand. Charlotte turned to look at me, and the teasing smile was there, but underneath it was something else. Her eyes were steady. Not reckless, not putting on a show, not the look of someone playing along with a joke she didn't mean. She was watching me, the way she'd watched me all evening, like she was trying to figure out whether I was still in there, under all the silence and the routine, and the years of building things to keep my hands busy. She said, "I dare you to kiss me." 4 words, plain and flat, no wiggle in her voice, no crack of a smile. She meant them. I could hear it the way you hear a plumb line hit true, that clean, certain sound when something is level. The yard went quiet in a different way than before. Not the quiet of waiting for a joke, but the quiet of waiting to see what a man would do with something real. My hands were at my sides and I could feel every person watching. And the smart thing, the safe thing, is to laugh and wave it off and give them the punchline they're expecting. But I looked at her eyes, and I saw what I'd been seeing all evening, the thing I'd been trying not to name because naming it would make it real. She wasn't daring me because it was funny. She was daring me because she wanted to know if I would choose to be brave when the whole world was watching and expecting me to choose safe. I stepped forward. I put one hand on the side of her face, gentle, the way you hold something you're not sure will stay. Her skin was warm, her jaw was set, and she didn't flinch or pull back or blink when I leaned down and kissed her. The kiss wasn't a quick peck or a joke or the kind that makes a room laugh and a game move on, but something real, soft and deliberate, the kind that says, "I chose this and I mean it and I know what it costs." The yard went dead silent. I heard Rick's beer bottle clink against the table behind me. I heard someone's kid ask a question in the house that I couldn't make out. I heard the smoker hiss and the string lights hum, and I heard my own heartbeat in my ears, which I hadn't heard in 5 years. When I pulled back, Charlotte's eyes were wide and dark, and her hand was on my wrist. She hadn't let go. Her fingers were pressed against my pulse, and I wondered if she could feel it, if she knew what it meant that my heart was doing something it had forgotten it could do. I didn't say anything, neither did she. The game had stopped, the circle had frozen, and I could feel the weight of 30 people trying to figure out what they'd just seen. Pete was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Rick's mouth was still open. I stayed for 10 more minutes. I couldn't look at anyone, and I couldn't look at Charlotte because looking at her again would mean I had to decide what came next, and I wasn't ready for that. I set my beer on the picnic table, told Pete I had an early morning, and walked out through the side gate to the sound of the yard finding its voice again behind me. The back road to my house is 7 miles of gravel and fir trees and nothing else, and I drove it slower than I needed to because I wasn't ready to be home yet. The cab of the truck felt different. It felt smaller, like the air had thickened, and I kept one hand on the wheel and the other on my knee, and I didn't know what to do with either of them because they still remembered the shape of her face. I replayed it. The silence after the kiss. The kind of silence that has weight and texture and direction. Rick's face with his mouth hanging open. Pete staring at me like I'd done something he'd been waiting years to see and didn't know he'd been waiting. And Charlotte, her hand on my wrist, her fingers on my pulse, her eyes wide and dark like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find. I told myself I'd made a fool of myself. A 52-year-old man kissing a 28-year-old woman at a backyard party because of a dare from a guy named Rick who'd had too many beers. That wasn't brave. That was the kind of thing people talk about at the hardware store on Monday morning. The kind of thing that gets a man a nickname he didn't ask for. I got home and didn't turn on the lights. The dog met me at the door, his nails clicking on the kitchen tile, his tail going in that slow, uncertain wag he did when he could tell something was off. I filled his bowl and stood in the dark kitchen listening to him eat. The house was exactly the way I'd left it, clean and quiet, empty in the specific way that a house is empty when it used to have someone in it. I took a glass of water to the porch and sat in the chair I'd sat in every night for 5 years. The crickets were going, and the sky was clear, and the fir trees stood against the dark like sentries, and I sat there and thought about Anne. 5 years of silence. 5 years of fixing things that didn't need fixing just to keep my hands moving, just to keep the stillness from settling into my bones. And then one kiss at a barbecue, and the silence had a shape again. It had weight and color and a heaviness I could name, because now I could feel the outline of what used to fill it. I told myself it wouldn't happen again, that it was a party and a game and nothing more. She was young and kind and probably already texting her friends about the weird older guy who took a dare too seriously. I would go back to the routine on Monday, and by next weekend, the whole thing would be a story people told at Pete's next barbecue, and I would be the punchline again, and that would be fine because being the punchline was safe. I went to bed. The dog curled up on the floor next to me, and I lay there in the dark listening to him breathe, and I didn't sleep for a long time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the steadiness in it, the way her hand had stayed on my wrist, and I couldn't make myself stop seeing it because I didn't actually want to. Sunday morning, I was in the workshop by 7, sanding the edge of the dining table for the family of 6, trying to lose myself in the grain the way I always did. The sander hummed, and the dust floated, and the dog slept in the corner on a pile of shavings, and for about 3 hours, it worked. The routine holding, the wood familiar, the measurements honest. Then my phone buzzed on the workbench at a little after 10, and the screen showed a number I didn't recognize. The message said, "It's Charlotte. Pete gave me your number. I hope that's okay." I stared at it for a full minute. The sander was still running in my other hand, and I didn't notice until the vibration traveled up my arm and reminded me I was holding it. I set it down and picked up the phone and typed 3 different responses and deleted all of them. The first was too long. The second was too short. The third tried to sound casual and came out sounding like a man trying very hard to sound casual, which is the opposite of casual. I finally sent "That's okay" and set the phone face down on the bench and went back to sanding, but my hands weren't in it anymore. She wrote back in under a minute. "There's a coffee place on Main Street, the one with the green awning. Tomorrow at 10? I went. I told myself it was just coffee, that it didn't mean anything, that people drink coffee with strangers all the time without it being a thing. I wore the blue shirt again, and I hated that I'd thought about it. Hated that I'd stood in front of the closet for 5 minutes choosing between 2 shirts when the answer was always going to be the same one, because it was the only one that wasn't wrinkled. She was already there when I walked in, sitting at a small table by the window with a book face down on the surface and a mug half finished in front of her. Her red hair was down this time, not pulled back, and it caught the light in a way that made me look longer than I meant to. She looked up and smiled. It wasn't the party smile, the one that came with the dare and the crowd and the string lights, but something smaller and quieter and more real. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about teaching 3rd grade, about how she'd spent the first week learning 32 names, and the second week learning which ones belonged to kids who needed extra patience. She told me about moving from Denver to a town where the freeway was a 20-minute drive, and the stars were different because there was no light pollution to wash them out. She asked about my work, and I told her about the dining table, and she asked questions about the wood that nobody had asked me in years. She wanted to know what kind of oak I used, why I preferred hand-cut dovetails over the router jig, and how I knew when a piece was done. I didn't mention Anne. She didn't ask. But I could feel the questions sitting there between us like a board waiting to be measured, patient and present and not going anywhere. When we left, she touched my arm as we stood on the sidewalk. Just a brief press of her fingers against the inside of my elbow, light enough to be accidental and deliberate enough that I knew it wasn't. She said, "I'm glad you came." I nodded because I couldn't find the words, and I drove home with the windows down again, and the air felt different than it had the night before, less heavy, more like something had been opened. She asked to see my workshop the following Wednesday, and I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Then I spent an hour cleaning it, which I never did because sawdust is just part of the landscape, and a clean workshop is a workshop where nobody's working. I told myself I cleaned it because the dust was bad, but I knew that wasn't true, and the dog gave me that look again, the tilted head one, like he was keeping track of how many times I'd acted out of character this week. She arrived at 6 o'clock with a bag of takeout from the diner in town and a 6-pack of root beer because she'd noticed I didn't drink much at the party. She walked through the workshop door and stopped, and I watched her eyes move across the space the way someone looks at a place that tells them something about the person who built it. The pegboard walls with their rows of chisels and planes and handsaws, the stacks of hardwood leaning against the far wall, the half-finished dining table on the center horses, the jewelry box in the corner that I'd started 2 weeks after Anne died and never finished because I didn't know who it was for anymore. She ran her fingers along the edge of the chair I was restoring for Pete's wife, feeling the grain, and she said, "You made this." It wasn't a question. She said it like she was naming something she'd just understood, and I said yes, and she nodded, and the nod carried more weight than a whole sentence from anyone else. I showed her around. The dining table for the family of 6, almost done, just needed final sanding and 3 coats of oil. A shelf unit for Pete's garage that I had been putting off because Pete's garage was a disaster and no shelf could fix it. The jewelry box in the corner, its edges raw, its lid unsanded, sitting there like a question I'd stopped trying to answer. She found the photo on the workbench. It was me and Anne at the Marion County Fair, maybe 10 years ago, both of us holding corn dogs and squinting into the sun. Charlotte picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, and set it down gently, like she knew it weighed more than paper. She didn't ask, but I told her. I told her about Anne, about the rainy Tuesday morning, about the phone call at the workshop, about the 5 years of silence after. I didn't cry. My voice stayed steady because that's the only way I know how to say something that big, by keeping it level, by holding the words the way you hold a board steady on the saw, firm and controlled so the cut comes out clean. Charlotte listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't say she was sorry, didn't say Anne sounded wonderful, didn't try to fill the silence with the kind of words people use when they don't know what else to offer. She said, "That's a lot to carry alone." 5 words that landed heavier than anything else could have, because they weren't pity, they were recognition. She picked up a piece of sandpaper from the bench and started helping me smooth the table edge. We worked side by side for an hour without talking much, and the silence between us was nothing like the silence I'd been living in. This silence had someone in it. It had warmth and breath and the sound of sandpaper on wood, and it was the most connected I had felt to another person in 5 years. I didn't know yet that a town like this one has a way of noticing when someone stops being invisible, and that noticing comes with opinions you didn't ask for. 2 weeks passed, and Charlotte and I saw each other 4 times. Coffee at the Green Awning Place on Main Street, a walk along the river on Sunday afternoon, Dinner at the diner where the specials are written on a chalkboard and the waitress calls everyone Hun. Another evening in the workshop where she helped me oil the dining table and got stain on her fingers and laughed about it. It was slow and careful, the way you test a frozen pond before you step, 1 foot at a time, weight held back until you're sure the surface will hold. I was at the hardware store on a Tuesday, buying wood screws and a new tube of wood glue, when I heard them. 2 guys in the next aisle, one of them Rick from the party. I didn't see them, but I heard Rick's voice, loud and carrying the way it always did, and he said, "You see old Victor's been hanging around with Pete's niece, the redhead? She's 28, man. He's 52. The other guy laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said, "What's he gonna do? Build her a house?" I set the screws down on the shelf. I didn't say anything. I paid for the glue and left, but the words stayed in my chest like a splinter you can't reach with your fingers, too deep to pull out and too sharp to forget. After that, I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. The look the waitress gave us at the diner when Charlotte reached across the table for my hand. The way her eyes moved from Charlotte's face to mine and then away, like she was doing math she didn't want to show. The way Pete brought up Charlotte's age in conversation, casual and pointed at the same time, like he was doing me a favor by making sure I hadn't forgotten the number. The way a guy at the gas station looked at us when we stopped for coffee on the way to the river, his eyes going from her to me and back to her with something that wasn't quite a smile. I told myself it didn't matter. I was a grown man and she was a grown woman, and what 2 guys said in a hardware store aisle was not my business. But it was my business because I had spent 5 years being invisible, and being invisible was safe in a way that being seen never could be. Being seen with Charlotte meant being seen, period. And being seen meant people got to have opinions about your life, and they would share those opinions whether you asked for them or not. The thing I couldn't stop thinking was that they might be right. Not about her, not about what she meant to me, but about the gap. 24 years is a long time. It's a whole generation, a whole life she hadn't lived yet. Maybe I was being selfish, taking something from a woman who didn't know yet what she'd want when she was my age. Maybe the kind thing to do was let her go before she figured it out. I started pulling back the next week. I canceled dinner on Wednesday, told her I had a deadline on the dining table, which was true in the sense that the table existed and had a deadline, but not true in the sense that I couldn't have made both work. I took longer to answer her texts, leaving them sitting on the workbench for an hour before I picked up the phone. And when I did answer, my words were shorter and flatter than they'd been. She noticed. Charlotte noticed everything, the same way I did, and I think that was part of what made the distance between us feel so loud. She showed up at the workshop on Friday evening, unannounced. I heard her truck pull up the gravel drive, and I had about 10 seconds to decide whether to pretend I wasn't there, and I was ashamed that I considered it. She didn't knock. She opened the door, crossed her arms, and looked at me the way someone looks at a leak they've been patient about for too long. She said, "You're pulling away." I didn't deny it because she would have known, and because denying it would have been an insult to both of us. I set the chisel down and wiped my hands on my apron and told her it was complicated. She said, "No, it isn't. You're scared, and that's simple." She was right, and I knew she was right, but knowing didn't make it easier. I told her about Rick at the hardware store, about the waitress, about Pete's comments, about the guy at the gas station. I told her people were talking, and I told her what they were saying, and I watched her jaw tighten as I said it because she'd heard it too, probably more than I had, and she'd been carrying it without showing me. Charlotte stepped closer. She put her hand flat on my chest, over my heart, and held it there the way Anne used to press her hand against the back of my neck, like she was trying to find the switch that held everything tight and turn it off. She said, "I didn't dare you to kiss me because it was funny. I dared you because I wanted to know if you were still in there under all the silence." And you were. My eyes burned. I covered her hand with mine and held it against my chest, and I could feel my heart pushing against her palm. And I didn't say anything because there wasn't a word big enough for what I was feeling. I just stood there in the workshop with the sawdust in the air and the evening light coming through the window and her hand on my chest. And for a few seconds, I let myself believe that this could be enough, that I could be the man she thought I was, that the gap between our ages didn't have to be the thing that undid us. Then I let go of her hand. I told her I needed time. She nodded, and the nod was slow and heavy. And she didn't argue because she wasn't the kind of person who argued when someone told her the truth, even when the truth was wrong. She walked out, and the workshop door closed behind her, and the sound of it was louder than it should have been, louder than a door has any right to be, because it sounded like something closing that I might not be able to open again. Monday morning, I called her. I sat in the truck in the parking lot of the hardware store with the engine off and the phone in my hand, and I called her because I'd decided over the weekend that the brave thing, the good thing, the right thing was to let her go. I told her I didn't think we should keep seeing each other. I said it wasn't fair to her. I said she was young and she had her whole life ahead of her, and I was a man who had already lived the best part of his, and it wasn't right for me to take up space in a life that should be going in a different direction. There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that has a temperature, and this one was cold. Then Charlotte said one sentence, and her voice was steady and hard, and I could hear her holding it together by force. She said, "You don't get to decide what's fair to me," and she hung up. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes with the phone in my lap and the parking lot emptying around me. I thought about how I'd heard that kind of silence before. The morning Anne didn't come home. The silence on the other end of the line when the hospital told me there was nothing they could do. This was different, and it was the same, because both times I had lost something, and both times the silence was the only thing left. The week that followed was the worst I'd had since the first year after Anne died. I went to work, and I ate, and I tried to sleep, but the silence in the house was different now. And I noticed the difference the way you notice a draft in a room that used to be warm. Before Charlotte, the silence was empty, a blank space I had learned to live in, the way you learn to live with a missing tooth. After Charlotte, the silence was full. It was full of what I'd said and what she'd said back, and the look on her face when I let go of her hand in the workshop, and the weight of that choice was heavier than the weight of Anne's loss. Because at least Anne's death wasn't something I'd chosen. I caught myself reaching for my phone a dozen times a day, pulling it from my pocket and starting to type her name before I'd stop and put it back, the distance between us growing wider with every brick I laid in the wall I couldn't figure out how to stop building. On Thursday, Pete showed up at the workshop. He didn't say hello or ask about the shelf unit. He walked in, leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and looked at me the same way he had the day he helped me clean out Anne's closet. The face he made when he was about to say something I didn't want to hear. He said, "You broke my niece's heart, you know that." I didn't respond. He let the silence sit for a moment, and then he said, "She called me last night. Charlotte, the woman who never cries. She was crying, and she said you told her it wasn't fair to her. And I want you to tell me how you figured that out. How'd you decide what's fair for a 28-year-old woman who moved across the country to start over and chose you?" I told him about the age difference, about Rick and the guys at the hardware store, about the waitress and the looks, and what people were saying in a small town where everyone knows everyone and nobody minds their own business. Pete listened to all of it, and then he stared at me for a long time. Long enough that I started to feel the silence pressing on my chest. He said, "My wife is 6 years younger than me. Nobody in this town has ever said a word about it. You know why? Because I didn't give them the power to say it. You're not protecting her, Victor. You're protecting yourself. You've been doing that for 5 years, and I've watched you. And I haven't said anything because I thought you'd figure it out. But she's crying in my kitchen, so I'm saying it now. How's that working out for you? The protecting, the silence." He left without waiting for an answer. I stood in the workshop alone, and the chisel was on the bench where I'd left it, and the dining table was half finished, and the jewelry box I'd started 2 weeks after Anne died was still sitting in the corner, with its edges raw and its lid unsanded. I'd started it because I needed something to do with my hands the night after the funeral, and I'd never finished it because I didn't know who it was for anymore. The wood had been sitting there for 5 years, waiting for a name, and I looked at it, and I knew. I drove to Charlotte's apartment that evening. She lived above the flower shop on Main Street, the same street as the coffee place where we'd had our first real conversation, and I parked across the road in front of the bank and sat in the truck with the engine running for 5 minutes. The flower shop was closed and the street was quiet, and the streetlight outside her window made a yellow circle on the sidewalk, and I sat in that circle and tried to figure out what I was going to say. I didn't have a speech, I didn't have a plan. I'd spent the drive rehearsing words, and none of them were right, because the thing I needed to say wasn't the kind you rehearse. I just knew that the jewelry box had a name on it now, and I couldn't finish it sitting in my workshop alone. I turned off the engine and walked across the street and up the stairs to her door. The stairs creaked under my boots, and I could hear music from inside, something quiet and acoustic, and I stood in front of the door and I knocked before I could talk myself out of it. I heard the music stop, I heard footsteps, and then the door opened, and Charlotte stood there. Her eyes were red, the kind of red that comes from more than one night of not sleeping, and her hair was down and she was wearing an old sweatshirt that was too big for her, and she looked at me without saying anything. She just looked, and the look held everything she wasn't saying, and I held still and let her look because I owed her that. I said, I was wrong. 3 words, and I meant them more than anything I'd ever said in my life. She didn't move. She didn't open the door wider. She kept her hand on the frame, her fingers white where she was gripping it, and she said, "Wrong about what?" I said, "Wrong about deciding what's fair to you. Wrong about letting Rick and a waitress and my own fear pick what my life looks like. Wrong about thinking the silence was safer than this." I didn't have anything else after that, because that was all of it, the whole truth. And the truth doesn't need a lot of words when it's real. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of long moment where everything you've built and everything you've broken hangs on what comes next. Her hand was still on the doorframe, her fingers were still white. Then she stepped back, and she opened the door wider, and she didn't say anything, she just made room. I walked in. The door closed behind me, and the sound of it was nothing like the sound of the workshop door when she'd left. This sound was softer, warmer, the sound of something closing that was meant to close, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence in a room didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something we were sharing. That was 3 months ago, and I'm sanding the jewelry box smooth now while Charlotte sits in the corner chair with her red hair catching the window light. I don't look up because I know she's there. He spent 5 years fixing everything except the one thing that mattered. If you've waited too long to let someone in, you know the cost. Pull up a chair. There's room here.